Fazbear Frights is an incredibly interesting book series and one that I've enjoyed for over a year. Contrary to what many others may say, it's a great addition to the FNAF universe and has many genuinely well-written stories. A select few are pure psychological horror and unrivaled by anything else in the series, in my opinion. Unfortunately, there's also a few that are less than satisfactory. These stories are the ones that the fanbase tends to fixate on the most, primarily because they're just purely bizarre. From Fetus Trap to Fazgoo, there's a ton of elements here that just don't quite add up, and it's given Fazbear Frights a very mixed reception over the years. Some, like me, choose to focus on the brilliantly constructed psychological horror of 1:35 AM and Blackbird, while others mock the pure absurdity of In the Flesh and The Puppet Carver. After taking note of Fazbear Frights' extreme highs and lows for a long time, I initially wanted to rank every story individually, but that would take far too much time and make far too much sense. Instead, I decided to rank each book by combining all three stories as well as the epilogue for a more condensed version. Something that's particularly interesting to me is that many of these highs and lows take place in the exact same book, so let's sort through the best and worst of Frights and determine how they affect each of the 12 books in the series. Before we jump into it, let's set some ground rules. All books will be ranked on the combined quality of all three stories and the attached Stitch Wraith Stinger. The books will be ranked on overall quality as well, consisting of multiple factors, primarily writing, characters, pacing, clarity, and the overall outline of the story, both in concept and execution. I'll be taking everything into account, including the endings, but I'll try to be as vague as possible about them as to not give any major spoilers. If you haven't finished Frights yet yourself, don't worry, you should be able to enjoy this video without having it spoiled for you and figure out what you're getting into beforehand as well. However, 12 books is a lot to sort through alone, so I've invited a friend to join me today. He's charismatic, he's British, and he has a semi-unhealthy love for fetch. Say hello to Mr. Matt.
Hello, are we live?
Well, technically this is a recording, but for all intents and purposes, sure, let's go with that. Anyway, Matt and I will be ranking the books together today. We each have a lot to say about different books, so we'll just be splitting this evenly and talk about whatever books we have the most to say regarding, respectively. Before we get started, however, do go check out Matt's channel in the description and cards. He streams nearly every single day right here on YouTube and makes some genuinely awesome content, so go support him and help him reach 1K. After you've done that, enjoy the video. Kicking things off, we have Gumdrop Angel, the 8th book in the series. The main reason why I believe that this book is the worst of the set is because it's the only book in the series that doesn't have a single average or above story, in my opinion. The second story, Sergio's Lucky Day, is definitely the most solid story in the volume, but still falls just barely short of average. Meanwhile, the other two stories are riddled with issues. Gumdrop Angel is a fairly well-written story, but falls apart completely simply because of how ridiculous the premise is. The fact that it's never explored more deeply later on leaves it as an extremely confusing and unbelievable story, as it's never quite explained how or why Fazbear Entertainment is running this whole gumdrop operation. Even now, as I say that out loud, it sounds utterly ludicrous. Meanwhile, What We Found, the last story in the book, is a jumbled mess that tries to be about 5 different things at once. Despite having Springtrap as the main antagonist, he doesn't really do anything throughout the whole story. Hudson basically just runs in circles around Fazbear's Fright and gets scared by hallucinations, while it also tries to tell a half-baked backstory. It's extremely confusing and just has no idea what it wants to be as a story, so it tries to do a little of everything and doesn't succeed at anything. Sergio's Lucky Day, while a decent story, isn't nearly enough to make up for the other two. The pacing is relatively slow and it makes for more of an interesting metaphor than a good story. Lastly, the epilogue is serviceable and average, but not completely mind-blowing like most of the other epilogues surrounding it. While it's nice to see an old story revisited, it isn't groundbreaking. The very safe and slightly below average story and epilogue aren't enough to make up for the two extremely weak ones, and as such, Gumdrop Angel is one book many Frights fans would be perfectly okay with forgetting. Next in line is Felix the Shark, the 12th book in the series that was never intended to exist. With Prankster officially concluding the Frights series, many were prepared to say goodbye at the end of 2021. That is, until Felix the Shark released. A collection of scrap stories replaced by better ones, this book often shows why these stories were left to rot. The titler story earns some points for having a terrifying ending, but is more than countered by the painfully slow pacing of the rest of the story. As Dirk takes ages to locate Felix at the old pizzeria, the reader is dragged right along with him pretty much every waking second. But when Dirk feels excitement of finding a minor clue, I personally often felt bored and found myself wishing we could just get to the interesting part already. As it would turn out, the interesting part was about 5 pages long and an 80-page story, which eliminated pretty much any good it might have done for this book's ranking. The scoop, however, was surprisingly solid and saved this book from taking the lowest spot on the list. Despite being written solely by Scott Kaufman and having a very meta premise, it actually subverts expectations multiple times and ends up being a pretty tragic tale with a fairly emotional ending. In fact, it almost moved the book even higher up in the ranking until You're the Band came along and instantly tore down any hope of that. This story is extremely inconsistent and poorly written. Despite having a decent start, it drags on for way too long, then realizes that it's out of time and crams what should have been the last 3/4 of the story into about 10 pages. The worst part is that, like Gumdrop Angel, it doesn't even make any sense and completely falls apart when thought about for even a moment. Its possible connection to the Stitch Wraith events only further complicates things by introducing a major character at the very last second and not having any clear place in the timeline. With this being the only book that has no epilogue, Felix the Shark hinges entirely on a single story that's barely above average and not strong enough to rescue it from the dumps.
So I've always thought that Fazbear Frights did an excellent job of capturing the core essence of FNAF, good and bad. Sadly, while it does have some of the best content in the franchise, it also has some of the worst. Bunny Call itself is, in my honest opinion, one of Frights' best stories. The protagonist is relatable and flawed, acting like a real person and making mistakes without becoming unlikable. Bob is also the father of a family rather than another teen protagonist that we've seen so often, and his experiences bring an important and uplifting message. The story's pacing and plot is also fantastic, and the unique concept of Ralpho is mysterious enough to raise intrigue without overdoing it, and avoids a frustrating mystery with inconclusive but useful hints and clues about the nature of Ralpho, in addition to a plot twist that ends the story with a bang. But as I said before, in the same volume, you can also get some truly atrocious stories. You've probably already heard of In the Flesh, since Frights haters tend to fixate on this one above all others. Between the unlikable protagonist, mediocre plot, and an utterly pointless and disgusting concept that adds nothing of value, this story severely lowers the ranking of Volume 5, and might just be the worst idea ever produced under the FNAF brand. And you'll never guess what the name of the protagonist is.
This one's personal.
Still, we have the man in room 1280. The last story is odd. The characters are pretty unique and the pacing is okay. I think it's a passable story, but the ideas and lore implications at play aren't particularly interesting and have been used to create theories that overcomplicate the games and try too hard to find connections where none really exist. Lastly, we have the epilogue, which avoids the volume being dead last, since aside from Bunny Call, this is the only intriguing and exciting part of the book worth reading, excellently tying the previous epilogues together before the setup for the climax in Volume 6. Prankster, like many of these lower ranked volumes, was just a disappointment. Often I think the wrong stories get picked for the title and cover art, and this one is no exception. The titular story is a copy-paste of generic American sitcom tropes and Help Wanted's plotline. You have a nice guy pining for a nice girl in a game development office with a stereotypically masculine bully character to boot. The pacing of the story is inconsistent, the build-up is actually quite unsettling, but the ending cuts off way too soon and raises far too many questions with zero answers in sight. The story is an absolutely pathetic 42 pages long, when almost every other story is about 80. And just like In the Flesh, the tie-ins with FNAF VR fall flat, since the story provides nothing new. It reads like a draft fanfiction. Moving on, we also have Kids at Play. This story isn't quite as bad as Prankster, but still fails to do much. The setup, themes, and main conflict are quite compelling, with a realistically flawed protagonist, but the ending of the story is utter nonsense that comes out of left field with no rationale, completely missing a satisfying conclusion to the story. Like far too many in Frights, Kids at Play opts for a random, pointlessly disgusting and over-the-top ending for the protagonist rather than an organic and natural conclusion, good or bad. Thankfully, however, this volume is saved from total oblivion by its last story, Find Player 2. From realistic and gripping characters to a well-paced plot, with unique twists that dodge the worn-out established Frights formula, Find Player 2 has it all. The story is unique, plays into themes such as fear and nostalgia well, it perfectly mutates something innocent and child-themed into something horrific and haunting with a brilliantly foreshadowed ending. In addition to all of this, of course, we have the epilogue, and not just any epilogue, but the epilogue of epilogues, ending the Stitch Race stingers with fantastic, satisfying, and thought-provoking conclusions for all of the characters. Prankster is severely weakened by its first two stories, but it's worth reading for Find Player 2 and Epilogue 11. Now this is a story worth reading. Say what you will about the overall volume, but The Cliffs is one of Fright's best, in my opinion. Firstly, it's a unique story that not only isn't another random, gory, formulaic trope fest, but also flips that exact established formula on its head, just as the formula was getting old. Secondly, The Cliffs is an incredibly powerful tale of raw human emotion, and remains one of the most realistic stories in the entire saga, in all of FNAF canon. I haven't even mentioned things like pacing and characters, but I don't need to when they are executed and balanced so well. Next is The Breaking Wheel, which, despite lacking clarity of its connection to FNAF, is a masterpiece of horror. Tension is built up at just the right pace, and the psychological panic and rapid running thoughts of the protagonist keep the reader guessing at whether Reed's fears about Julius are really true. Plus, the characters themselves are quite well written. The ending is fantastic, playing into the same psychological horror setup from the start. With two effective stories in Volume 7, the third story is, of course, a tragedy. A tragedy of compelling writing, that is. He Told Me Everything offers little other than one of the most absurd concepts in FNAF, Phasgoo. Yes, the very same Phasgoo that introduces cloning for absolutely no purpose, either in the story or the wider FNAF canon, which it fails to connect to on a fundamental level. This plot is bizarre, it has huge scale implications that are never addressed, characters that are never explored deeply enough, and a scale of science fiction that simply does not make sense, regardless of whether this was a FNAF story or not. While the epilogue of this volume is the exciting climax and twist to the Stitch Wraith narrative, bringing some interesting lore to things, the overall volume is middling. Finding a Frights volume without at least one bad story dragging down its ranking from an otherwise consistent and excellent placing is, as you will see in this video, quite rare.
Matt and I actually had a rather tough time ranking this book against the last two, but we ultimately decided that Friendly Face, the 10th book in the series, is just a notch above the rest. Many discount this book as low quality because of the sheer absurdity of the first two stories, but it's actually not a bad entry at all. The titler story definitely could have been a bit creepier and reuses many concepts from older stories, but the characters are genuinely well set up, and it's a shockingly heart-wrenching story about dealing with grief and tragedy. Speaking of good characters, Sea Bonnie's, widely considered one of the most ridiculous stories in the series, has an unbelievably well-written protagonist and decent pacing to boot. Mott is quite smart for a horror protagonist and does everything he can to keep himself safe, making the story all the more horrifying. Together Forever, however, is by far my favorite of the three. I won't spoil much, but it's a downright brutal and extremely gory story with so much theory fodder. Everything about the ending is just absolutely wonderful despite the initial pacing being slow. The epilogue is the perfect cherry on top and is what really solidifies this volume as worth reading. With a thrilling sequence from start to finish connecting a bunch of stories and characters found across them, I'd go as far as to say that it's the best epilogue of them all by quite a bit. But if you think that sounds great, just wait until you hear what we have to say about the top half of Frights. I mentioned toward the beginning of this video that many of Fazbear Frights' highs and lows tend to occur in the same books, and there is no better example of that than The Puppet Carver. The 9th book in the series is a turbulent ride that puts the best and worst of Frights on full display, and it starts off with nowhere to go but up. The titular story is an extremely good candidate for the worst story in the entire series, with an extremely confusing plotline that's never explained, largely unlikable and disjointed characters, and the return of a villain that's almost universally hated among the community. The book was off to an extremely bad start, but thankfully Jump for Tickets helped remedy that somewhat. A solid story that preys upon the rather common fear of claustrophobia, it manages to be an interesting and unsettling story despite feeling fairly similar to a few past entries. What really seals the deal, however, is Pizza Kit, my favorite Fazbear Frights story of all time and an extremely strong contender for the best story across all 12 volumes in my opinion. I could, and probably should, make an entire video analyzing why this particular story is so amazing and flawless in my eyes, but to keep it short, it utilizes psychological horror and plot twists to a masterful level, and is pure unrestrained nightmare fuel from start to finish. While many complain that it's only loosely related to the FNAF setting, the story's incredible writing and terrifying premise more to make up for it. If Jump for Tickets was able to cancel out Puppet Carver, then Pizza Kit is what carries the book on its back to a spot in the top half. To top it off, the epilogue is sadly quite weak on its own, but sets up for the incredible epilogues 10 and 11 very nicely and isn't terribly boring. Like virtually every other epilogue, it's passable and leaves Puppet Carver as the sole thing keeping this book out of a very high-placed finish. Back to where it all started, the wonderfully nostalgic days of when we thought that a time-traveling ball pit would be the weirdest thing to pop up in the Frights timeline. When most people think of Frights, they typically immediately think of Into the Pit, and rightfully so. As the first Fazbear Frights story and book, it sets the tone for what's to come. Peculiar, bizarre ideas told through solid writing and abstract explanations. The titular story is a very unique way of retelling the missing children's incident. To Be Beautiful is quite a horrifying story that some people deeply relate to, and Count the Ways has wonderful pacing with an underused presentation of flicking between the past and present. Plus, the epilogue does a great job of introducing the Stitch Wraith, as well as making us realize that many stories across the books are connected to each other in this shared universe. In a lot of ways, Into the Pit is Fazbear Frights done right, all throughout. This is one of the few volumes that I can honestly say doesn't have a bad story, and the epilogue is quite cool as well. The only thing holding it back is that it doesn't have any great stories either. Pretty much every story here is just a bit above average, and that's it. However, it by no means plays it too safe. There's plenty of new interesting concepts introduced here, and it's just an all-around solid book and a great starting point for new Frights fans. Alas, the writing, concepts, characters, and everything else that shapes a story is all slightly above average, nothing more, nothing less. As a result, it sits comfortably in the top half, and it's a real good thing to remember Fazbear Frights by, just not technically the best thing. We'll get to that later.
As this video has demonstrated, I like to be quite critical. Expressing the hows and whys of media's flaws is just as important as complimenting its strengths, and is crucial to understanding how to review art fairly. This is especially true with an interconnected franchise like FNAF, and in the vast realms of the books. While I've talked about plenty of failures and negatives, I can now finally take the time to talk about some of the best FNAF stories ever written. Fetch doesn't quite make it to top 3, but that story alone is one of my favourites. Greg is a compelling and motivated protagonist who the reader can relate to. He lives a normal life. One of the things that actually makes him stick out to me is that, rather than having serious problems with his life, he actually has a lot to lose, and was living happily until his own personality traits, his scientific curiosity, and his overconfidence wreck everything via Fetch. Not only is Fetch the antagonist of the story, obviously, but he is a catalyst for Greg's very own hubris, his ego, to bring him down. There's tense and ominous build-ups with gore that make for good horror, there's well-placed dialogues with multiple characters, none of which feel flat, and in addition to the strengths of the plot, people, and pacing, this story carries fascinating lore and ties into both games and the Stitch Wraith stinger/epilogues, which feel quintessentially FNAF. Politely call it semi-unhealthy, but my love for Fetch is ruined by only one thing: the ending. The story cuts off, as if the last few pages were ripped out, and Greg's character arc is never truly resolved. It's sudden and unsatisfying. Were it not for that ending, this story, in my eyes, would be perfect. Still, at least Fetch's story was concluded later on. But moving on, Volume 2 also has Lonely Freddy. Admittedly, this story is pretty weak. The pacing is too slow, the characters are hit and miss, the dynamic between Alec and his sister isn't the most iconic. There are also unresolved wider consequences of the existence of the Lonely Freddys. The story doesn't lead anywhere. But the concept is unique, interesting, not too sci-fi, and everything else is passable enough, though I wouldn't consider it worth a reread. What really brings this volume to a balanced 4th place in our ranking is the 3rd story. Out of Stock isn't the deepest or the most mysterious story, but it's a well-paced adventure, a perfect capturing of childhood fantasy and horrific twists typical of Frights. Oscar and his buddies are likeable characters we can empathise with, the plush trap chaser is a simple but disturbing twist on a familiar fan favourite from the games, and the ending is happy, satisfying, and like no other story, rolls straight into the epilogue fluidly, where the Stitch Wraith quite literally picks up the pieces. Epilogue 2 isn't super important, but it's a good build-up to the mystery of the Stitch Wraith and links forward to the real Jake, with some brilliant perspective from Larson and show-not-tell characterization of Margie. And so, we come to the top 3. This is what you're most likely watching for. It's pretty obvious which of Frights sucked, but what did Ambience and I agree to rank the best out of it all? Starting in 3rd is Step Closer, with an A-tier titular story. Beginning with a unique time jump that previews action later on, just like the Silver Eyes, and both feature Foxy, how interesting. Step Closer provides a unique concept, magnificently subtle execution that feels extremely grounded, as if it could really happen in the real world, and, best of all, realistic characters. Pete, the frustrated big bully brother to Chuck, the intelligent little ball of innocence, provides nuanced emotions and responses to the plot as the protagonist. Chuck is an excellent foil to him. The development of the characters is paced well, with the back and forth dynamic fitting for their ages, and the tragedy is amplified greatly by the writer's choice of having the perspective switch from Pete to Chuck multiple times. As a bonus, like Fetch, this story also has strong theory fodder, as the whole thing is effectively a twist on FNAF 4's minigames. The next story isn't quite so good, however, and is the sole reason Step Closer was not tied with the above 2 volumes. Dance With Me offers a unique protagonist, who is written brilliantly, but utterly fails to provide enough plot points for the whole thing not to feel like a drag. The message of giving 2nd, 3rd, or however many chances is honourable, but otherwise it flops. The core concept of the threat is lacking clarity, Casey's reactions to it are contrived for plot reasons, and worst of all, the story took one of FNAF's most unique, mysterious, and interesting characters, only to use her as an unspeaking, unacting, voiceless void of vague threat. Ballora, in this story, says nothing, does nothing other than spin closer and closer. Ballora could have been swapped out with anything or anyone and this story would not change. The story is worth reading, but thankfully the volume ends on a less mediocre note. Coming Home is one of the greatest standalone tales of the FNAF books. Plot, pacing, done beautifully, cleverly. Characters, surprisingly emotional and developed for preteens. The twist, very, very clever. This is a story that you must read twice, because it's a different experience coming home, haha punny, back to this story. Susie and Samantha are both interesting characters, and like the Pete-Chuck dynamic, contrast each other and provide 2 perspectives for the story to be told and the mystery to unravel in. This story is unlike Step Closer in a lot of ways, however, and to say more would be to spoil one of the best experiences I've ever had with Five Nights at Freddy's. And I almost forgot, you know what seals the deal with Volume 4 being one of the best despite its failings? The epilogue. All I'll say is this, characterization. Very, very good characterization, and plot development, actually. It would seem to me that, other than Dance With Me, every story in this volume brought some kind of child-teen dynamic duo that has remained absolutely iconic in my mind. Coming in second is one of my favourite volumes. It's hard to pick one, but believe me when I say that this ranking was very, very close with the final book. Volume 3 brings plenty to Frights and FNAF's wider whole. The first story follows Delilah, a protagonist I might be biased talking about since I personally relate to her troubles sleeping. I think I speak on behalf of Ambience too when I say that her initial struggle, that real, grounded human struggle of just managing to get out of bed for work when both her mind and body are dragging her down, is something immensely relatable and believable. It really hits home. Of course, it's not long before the supernatural threat takes center stage, and the Ella doll is memorable as a unique and mysterious threat, providing genuine psychological horror to the max, on par with just a few of the Frights rogues gallery, such as Ralpho or Fetch, while also enhancing Delilah's character arc. The symbolic nature of Ella is immaculately executed, with great pacing for a longer story. Even the supporting characters, such as Delilah's spiritual foster sister Harper, or her quirky neighbor Mary, stand out, which is especially impressive considering how many dozens of secondary human characters exist in Frights. 1:35 AM excels in every way, and even has some lore ties for fans to enjoy. But that's just story number 1. Following what is, in my honest opinion, a near-perfect start, Volume 3 brings us room for one more, a unique, scary, and intriguing story. It's not perfect, but Room for One More brings more obscure characters, the mini-renas, into the limelight in a deceptive and disturbing way, with many lore threads connecting back to sister location. Fan service aside, the protagonist Stanley is quite likeable, even if his decisions are sometimes contrived for plot reasons. Most of his dialogue and choices are realistic in a way that adds to an already tense story, and the ending of this story complements the setup perfectly. It is a simple, all-rounded narrative that doesn't fail in any serious way. Last of the 3 is The New Kid, a somewhat controversial but ultimately high-quality story. While the pacing is slow to begin with, and the ending very confusing, too mysterious, pretty much everything else in this story hits the spot. Devon and Mick are both immensely developed characters, and once again we have this dual perspective that effectively goes very, very deep into the mentality of these troubled dead-end street teenagers. Springlocks make one of their best returns yet. The horror throughout doesn't rely on anything extreme or even supernatural, making it even more terrifying when something inexplicable does happen. The New Kid might have some issues with pacing and mystery, but even without the cherry on top that is the potential lore value of this story, its characters and concepts carry it to a well-executed finish. Last, but not least, Epilogue 3 brings us the entire story of Phineas Taggart and the origin story of the Stitch Wraith. This epilogue wins a high score in our books for its compelling plot, mind-blowing concepts, and brilliant characterization, all in a matter of pages. And with that, I've said plenty, so with 1:35 AM and a strong silver second, there's only one ranking left to explain. Ambience, take it away.
Blackbird is the closest thing to all-around perfection that we've seen in a FNAF book to this day, and I will die on that hill. 1:35 AM was amazing, and believe me, we had a really hard time deciding which one came out on top, but Blackbird ultimately edges it out. Kicking things off, the titler story is outstanding psychological horror and is arguably on par with 1:35 AM in that department. The way the Blackbird silently stalks Noel and the various theories surrounding the story instantly made it one of my favorites. There's so many different interpretations, and it's hard to tell which one is the scariest. With an utterly terrifying premise, well set up and believable characters, and a really meaningful message to top it off, this story starts off the 6th volume with a bang. It's immediately followed up by The Real Jake, easily one of, if not the most emotional stories in the series. It ties into the epilogues in a really cool way, including past epilogues, but besides that, it's just an incredibly moving story with really sympathetic and well-written characters. I've never cried at a book or movie before, but I was fairly close to tears by the time I finished reading this one and thinking about all the implications. Hide and Seek is typically the least well-liked of the 3 stories, but I've still always had a soft spot for this one. It's a pretty unique story with a lot of twists and an incredibly bleak message that needs to be heard. Maybe it's just because I strongly related to Toby at one point in my life, but I think this one is a lot better than most people give it credit for. It's just overshadowed by the first 2 stories. Overall, this volume just doesn't miss, and the epilogue finishes out strong with an incredibly ominous ending that really builds the atmosphere perfectly heading into Volume 7. With some of the most incredibly well-crafted characters yet, no bad stories, a great epilogue, and incredibly meaningful messages to be found in each story, Blackbird is the best of the best, and alongside 1:35 AM, is the Frights that I'll always choose to remember. If there's one thing I want you to take away from this video if you're considering getting into Fazbear Frights, please do. The series definitely has its ups and downs, but it gets a way worse reputation than it deserves. A lot of stories are honestly incredibly well written and super interesting. Even if you don't have time to read them, at least listen to an audiobook sometime, it's worth it. We had a super hard time ranking most of them, they were that close in quality. Anyway, massive thanks to Matt for helping me rank these books, since I'm probably too indecisive to have done it on my own. He runs his own channel, like I said at the beginning of the video, with near daily streams and a lot of great content. He's a real entertaining guy. Go subscribe to him. He's getting very close to 1K, and that's a milestone he definitely deserves, so help him out with that. Speaking of which, a while back we did 2 streams where we ranked each and every story individually, so if you're curious about that and have a few hours to waste, check it out. One last thing about his content, if you've been enjoying FNAF analysis so far, then you'll definitely enjoy his new channel, Continuity Error. I've been hooked on every video so far, it's very interesting analysis and is incredibly well set up, and I'm sure you'll enjoy those while you wait for the next episode. While we're on the topic of people who helped make this video possible, thanks to my friend ToyBonnie360 for making the great thumbnail. His channel is linked in the description, support him too. With that being said, remember to... wait, what's the line again?
Stay hydrated.
Ah, that's it. Thank you guys for watching this analysis, I hope you found it as thought-provoking as I did, and I will see you in the next one. And, yeah, stay hydrated.